Hello, I'm Spencer Judge. I'm an engineer at Transparent Systems. I work primarily on our blockchain implementation and services that surround it. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about what we do at Transparent Systems and how we leverage Substrate to help us do that. I'm also going to spend a little bit of time on how we, as a company, sort of try to strike a balance between the existing financial system and infrastructure and sort of the world of blockchain and crypto. And people in those spaces have pretty different ideas about sort of how things are supposed to work, and so we're going to talk a little bit about those differences and how we help reconcile some of them. So all right, what's Transparent Systems? Our primary product that we're trying to ship right now and in the middle of working on is a settlement platform for US dollars, right? So that means it needs to be something that businesses can use to transfer large sums of money, not just sort of small amounts like you might have seen in something like Venmo or Zelle that maybe you pay your friends with. If you're not aware, those systems have limits of, I believe it's around $2,500 like a week that you can send. So that's not enough to actually do business with, right? It's fine if you want to pay your friend for the movies or whatever, but it's not really going to be sufficient for actual business usage. So, something that can move larger sums of money, like what we're making, you can actually use to settle your accounts on a routine basis. We think at Transparent Systems, as I'm guessing probably a lot of you are aware, that the financial system is really quite outdated and inefficient, and it can be probably substantially improved, and in our opinion, without totally needing to sort of remake the world. And the lack of innovation in the financial space until pretty recently, I mean, there's a lot of startups coming up now doing similar things to what we're doing. We're not the only one by any means. But that lack of innovation has been pretty shocking. And what I meant when I sort of talked about striking a balance in the first slide is that, we think now's the time to provide faster, cheaper financial tools that fit into existing financial machinery, rather than sort of coming along and trying to totally remake the world before anyone can use the new technology. We think blockchain's a really interesting candidate to support this type of innovation, as a lot of other people do. But we think, there probably aren't a whole lot of organizations that have tried to really seamlessly integrate with the traditional mechanisms. And we think we're positioned well to be able to do that. And we think Substrate is a really great platform to let us hit the ground running with something that provides a lot of what we need to begin with. And then, as you can see here on the slide, we are backed by some pretty big names. We just recently finished raising Series A. I encourage you to go, Google us and look at our blog releases. Okay, so, who wants faster, cheaper settlement? And let me actually take a step back and, clarify what settlement is, just in case not everyone is completely aware. So when I say settlement, I want you to imagine some retail institution, like let's say a bagel shop that makes bagels. They've got suppliers, like for example, the people that they buy flour from to make the bagels with. And when they take the shipment of the flour, it's not like the guy's literally giving the delivery man cash to buy the flour with. They keep open accounts, and on some routine basis, like once a quarter or a month or whatever, they pay off their debts. Right, the bagel maker will just go and pay the flour maker, and they do that occasionally. And if you're a really big bagel business, let's say you're like Einstein Bagel, the big chain here, that could be millions of dollars a quarter, right? So it's not something you're going to be able to use, Venmo or something again. And traditionally, what you would use is something called, in the United States at least, something called FedWire or ACH, which are mechanisms for sending wire transfers. And they take days, and they're quite expensive, and have a lot of downsides compared to something that is fee-free and relatively instant. So our goal is to help businesses replace those existing settlement mechanisms I just mentioned with something that's simple and transparent. And that means interacting with a lot of different businesses, right? I think it's pretty easy when you work in software to get stuck in this mindset of the software industry. But turns out most of the businesses out there aren't software businesses, and a lot of them don't have particularly skillful employees who know how to use technology, or even what blockchain is, or do they care? So you're interacting with a lot of people who, per the title of this talk, are squares, right? They're not really hip to what's current in the financial scene, and nor do they care, nor should they, right? It's not important to them. And so this is going to be a CFO or an accountant at some small or large firm. So what do they care about, right? A couple of things, right? Some just table stakes stuff. It's got to be legal, right? No business that does any significant volume legally is going to be interested in any illegal solutions. Obviously, it's got to be illegal. It has to be stable, right? So we have seen quite a few companies and organizations publish stablecoins. We've also seen a lot of them not be maintained and miss the peg. For anyone who's intending to actually do settlement like I described, if I buy flour today and I think that the amount of tokens I have X percent or X amount, and later that week it's 10% less than that, I can't run a business that way, right? It has to be relatively stable. Convenience is also remarkably important, right? Users just don't adopt things that are hard to use, even if they might be better in some like philosophical or objective sense. People don't care, right? They just don't. It has to work first. If it doesn't work, and if it's not substantially easier or as easy, they probably just won't even try it, right? They also care a lot about liquidity. I'll just briefly describe that too, in case those of you aren't aware. It refers to sort of how available funds are, right? Cash is totally liquid because you can use it right away for almost anything. Stocks, for example, are pretty liquid, but less so. You'd have to sell them. You'd have to find a buyer for your stock before you can get cash. So something like Bitcoin, for example, is pretty liquid, but maybe not as liquid as you might desire, because the confirmation times take a little while. There's some transaction overhead. There's some stuff that makes it less desirable than cash. Okay, so what do squares specifically not care about, right? They don't care what a private key is. They probably don't even know what a private key is. They don't care how blockchain works. They might care in the sense that they know that if they put it in their name, their stock price might go up. So it's got that going for it. But they don't care, about the technological aspects. They don't necessarily care about being independent from fiat currency. They don't really care about the game theory of blockchains. These things are all really interesting and really important when you look at them from certain perspectives. But if I'm just the bagel shop guy, I don't care about any of this, right? So you can make some really great arguments that they probably should care about these things. But sort of like I was getting at in the last slide, they probably don't, and you're probably not going to change their mind. But why would a blockchain be a selling point to these people? It isn't, in some sense, right? But if we can leverage blockchain to make a product better in some way that they can understand, like, for example, that the settlement costs less or that it happens faster, okay, that's something they're interested in. So I'll actually tell a little story here. I used to work at a company called Tableau Software. Some of you might be familiar with. They make a data analytics software. So, I guess the short way to say it is they turn sort of databases into pretty graphs, right? And interestingly, Tableau as a company actually had a bit of a philosophy too, which is that humans are better at visual analytics than they are at reading text tables. So we could, make the world a better place by enabling people to make better business decisions by enabling them to understand their data better. But again, same thing to this sort of concept around blockchain and crypto that I'm talking about. No one really cares about that. What they care about is, being able to do better by their business or their employees or whatever. So if we sold them a product first that was easier to use than Excel, for example, but they could still use it the same way. They could still do text tables if they really wanted to, right? And then as you sort of bought them in with, look how easy this is and look how well we've done, maybe you should start to listen to sort of some of our philosophy and get away from some of these text tables and start looking at things visually. And you could bring them with you. and they started to see the value, and they started to get excited, and you started to really bring people on board with your vision. And so I think we've seen a number of efforts in the sort of blockchain and crypto space that are really motivated from a place that's like, wow, this technology is so powerful, and these sort of ideals about economics and distributed control are really admirable, and we want to make the world a better place by bringing these things into the financial space, and that's great. But the problem is most people just are totally fine with having centrally controlled, like surveilled financial systems. Like they're totally okay with that because it lets them live their day-to-day lives. Right. If all of a sudden tomorrow I could flip a switch and force everyone to use Bitcoin, a lot of people would be really unhappy, right? Even if maybe it was sort of better for them in a couple aspects. So, people are really interested in things that don't require them to change their habits much at first. So, that all said, let's get into some of the tech stuff. How do we do that for our customers? Right? How do we expose an easy interface? Nothing totally groundbreaking. We have wrapped Substrate in a bunch of APIs. But, I think we've provided some interesting things by doing that, so I'm going to sort of step through that. When I talk about our customers in this situation too, I mean sort of both end-to-end customers and other teams in the company who are writing sort of even higher level APIs, providing the types of top level financial services I was discussing on top of our API. So something as simple as maybe send money from me to this person, right, in a very easy to describe format. And we wanted to make this easy to use because, we don't want to have to be in a position where we can only hire blockchain or crypto experts, right? We want a system that other people can develop on top of without needing to be total experts all the way down to the bottom. They should know, of course, a little bit about what's going on, but they don't necessarily need to be a complete Substrate expert, for example. This also allows us to support sort of varying levels of sophistication in the way that you interact with the API. So let's say you're a very sophisticated customer and you don't trust anyone, and you'd like to construct and sign transactions completely by yourself 100% of the time. Okay, we allow that. You can kind of talk directly to the Substrate part of the validator. Or if you're, not that into the weeds, you can use something a little bit easier, like the send money from A to B type of API I described before. Okay, so what does that look like? Let's look at this technical diagram. So this is an overall view of how other services we author and services that our customers might author would interact with our network. So I hope my mouse is visible on the screen. If you look at this box at the top left of the big box called TPFS API, that's sort of the main entry point for all of the sort of custom changes and things we've built on top of Substrate. So you'll see that this API talks to the outside world via a gRPC port. And this is, we think, a nice feature because Substrate by default, right, is providing like a WebSocket and an HTTP sort of JSON RPC API. And we'll look at a comparison with that after this slide. WebSockets are great, nice and high performance, but a little bit new. Maybe not necessarily everyone knows how to use them super well. The HTTP version might be maybe less performant than you might desire, depending on what you're doing. So gRPC strikes a really cool balance because it sort of gives us a lot of the performance that WebSockets might, but it also sort of makes a lot of things really easy, right? You can auto-generate clients for it, as you can see in this little, sort of transparent box I've got over here. And that's a nice thing because if we have some customer who's using a language that we're not, we can at minimum hand them an auto-generated client right away and let them get the ground running. And then if we decide we want to support that language more fully, we can come along and wrap it in something a little bit more ergonomic, which we've done in Rust and TypeScript so far, for example. Some other nice properties of gRPC is sort of wire level backwards and forwards compatibility is a really nice thing to be able to do. So that sort of allows us to have clients who aren't necessarily up to date with the latest version of whatever the Substrate runtime might be, or even the TPFS API inside of it. So that way we can sort of do more staged rollouts, which is really desirable. So then you'll also see that the TPFS API talks to the Substrate JSON RPC API sort of internally, right? And it can either do that over the memory transport or the WebSocket transport. So if you desire, you can actually remove TPFS API from, and I'm sorry, I failed to mention this, that whole box sort of represents one validator. It could be a full node, it could be a light node. So you can also break our API out of that if you desire and sort of scale it slightly independently. You also notice this other box I've got called Petri. That's I use that name because it grows the substrate like a Petri dish. In this case, it's really sort of just a dumb cache that provides some caching around things that is a little bit challenging to access from Substrate directly. In this case, sort of the number one example we have is just if I want to look up the history of transactions for some specific address, that's a little bit challenging to do. So we have Petri running on an ongoing basis, sitting right there in the validator, looking at finalized blocks and going and stashing cache state in the RocksDB store, the same RocksDB store Substrate uses, but in a slightly different place. And then additionally, we haven't actually implemented this, but this is something we certainly intend to do, is be able to use that same sort of rolling process to store things in a relational database or some other type of database that you might perform analytics on, like hook up Tableau to it, for example, and show pretty graphs to users about transaction history or state of how much money there is in the system. The TPFS API can also sort of perform some authentication features, which you think are really desirable. I think this is something that is actually really critical to getting the kind of traditional users I was talking about working well with the system, right? Because if you go to some relatively large enterprisey company, they're probably going to have some established authentication system like LDAP, or if they're really new, maybe something like OAuth, but that would be unusual for an old enterprise corporation. So they already have a way to authenticate certain users to do certain things, and they really, really don't want to replace that. That's something you'll get a lot of pushback from if you try and ask people to replace authentication systems. So, if they have some, like, let's say the CFO, Bob, they want to allow him to send any amount of money at any time, the TPFS API might reach out to their auth server, get temporary authorization for the key, use it to sign a transaction that moves $1 million or whatever. And that can be through an HSM or something quite secure. And then, Joe, just accountant guy who only has access to petty cash funds or whatever, he might only be approved to sign $5,000 transactions, right? And so the system will only let him do that. But as I mentioned earlier, if a company has a desire to totally handle all that by themselves, they can not use the TPFS API. They can disable it completely, interact with Substrate directly, interact with the rules of our runtime directly, and they'll have to understand how to construct extrinsics and sign them properly. They'll have to understand how to do all these things themselves, but they have that option, which is nice. And so in this system, we should be able to run with either a full or a light client. They should scale pretty independently along with the rest of Substrate. So we think this design gives us some pretty nice properties. Okay, so what does that actually look like in practice? Here's just a really simple example. Let me say ahead of time, this isn't to say that I don't like the Substrate JSON RPC API. I actually do a lot, and I think that the level of detail it's chosen makes a lot of sense in terms of the performance you would expect at that level. But that's not to say that it's eminently usable by someone who maybe doesn't have a lot of familiarity with the system. If you look at this top box, right, it's basically all binary, right? We've got a handful of other things in plain text, but you have to understand, in this case, the parity scale encoding to be able to do anything with this string. And not only do you have to understand scale encoding, you have to understand specifically the extrinsics in our runtime, what they look like, how they're composed in order to be able to decode this properly. And that's pretty easy and straightforward if you use the provided JavaScript API. But if you're not, there's not a whole lot of things that do this off the shelf for you super easily right now. So debugging that can be, or not debugging, deserializing that can be a little bit of a challenge. So if we contrast that with on the bottom, here we have an example, and to be fair, I'm kind of cheating here. Those of you who are familiar with gRPC would know that this would actually be binary over the wire, so I cheated a little bit. But I'm not going to consider it cheating because, like I mentioned, you can get the auto-generated clients for gRPC, so I can get an auto-generated client that deserializes this for me, and I didn't have to do a ton of work. And once it's deserialized, it looks something like this in JSON, right? Very straightforward. We've got some user transaction, there's some address, there's some operation, which in this case is a payment. It's going to some other address, and it's for some amount. So, very, very readable, very debuggable. gRPC has been around for a long time. It's been around for, I think, about almost 15 to 20 years at this point. Google originally developed it. And so there's actually quite a bit of pretty solid tooling for debugging and, watching streaming interactions with the server and stuff like this. So that's sort of the sum total of everything, is to get to this point of, look, we made it a little bit more usable. But surprisingly, that the lesson that I'm trying to impart here is that matters for so much. It's amazing how much this very minor difference can make, especially to people who aren't incredibly technologically savvy. And with that, I'm finished. So it's time for Q&A. I'm watching the CrowdStrike chat in here. I'm also on the Discord. So if you guys have questions for me, please send them my way, and I'd be happy to answer at the last. I think we got about 5 minutes left. Excellent. Is TPS API a thin gRPC converter on top of the Polka.js API? Yeah, kinda. It's an interesting question. Like, when I mentioned Parity, if you recall on that one slide where I said that it goes and sort of caches some data somewhere, that's a good example of something that I can't really do by extending the Substrate JSON RPC API. I would have to actually change the way that Substrate stores data, which would be extreme, and isn't something that we would want to contribute upstream to Substrate for, because it would have all sorts of performance characteristics and trade-offs that people might not desire. So that's a good example of something that isn't just a thin converter. In that case, the server actually takes a gRPC request, goes and does something interesting with Petri, includes it in the response, and it might also gather some stuff from Substrate at the same time. Hopefully that answers that question. Another one, any chance the gRPC API can be part of the default Substrate nodes? Proposing it upstream as an alternative to JSON RPC. That's a really interesting idea. I haven't actually chatted with the Substrate technical team much about that. We would be happy to do that if the maintainers are interested in that. I can see some reasons that maybe it might not be. There's already at least two kinds of transports, and at least they both use the same sort of format, JSON. This would now be a totally different format, as well as a technically kind of a different transport, HTTP2 instead of, I guess it's the same as WebSockets. So I would have interest in contributing it. That's really a question for them, right? I'd be happy to chat about it with the Substrate maintainers. Well, cool. Thanks for those questions, guys. If you got anything else, I'll be sticking around in Discord, so feel free to do that. I'm going to post a link to my slides in here too, as well as my email, so that you guys can send me any questions you have.
Great. Thank you so much, Spencer. We're going to move into our next session, so I'll see you in there.
Great.